was wondering if from the words, you send us the material about what did Jesus say, right? What was the thing that he really said? Can you analyze from just looking at what Jesus supposed to have said, what was really, where he really came from? Was he influenced by the Essene? Had he been to India? Was he, can you somehow take what he said and look at it and say,
what influenced him?
yeah, it's obviously the guy was married, or obviously he was not married, just by studying what he said. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yes, yeah, I think we can draw a certain number of conclusions from the things he said in terms of what influenced him. As I said, sometimes there are sayings of Jesus that we're not sure whether that really originated with him or with someone else, but there are others that it seems almost certain that they originated with him. And so that's sort of the foundation, I think, for looking at what he said and what he taught.
Right.
And so as I said, what we have from him on marriage is a little bit ambiguous. And so it's difficult to know, for me, to draw a conclusion one way or the other. But there are things that we know pretty clearly. Jesus had women companions, including one who's especially close to him. He had women disciples, right? Including Mary, but also others that are mentioned and referred to in the Gospels, which was very unusual, right? Because usually there were male teachers with male disciples, although women could learn in the synagogue, but they couldn't really. They it was expected they would attend synagogue meetings, but they weren't allowed to study with a rabbi, put it that way, right? So Jesus is a rabbi, but he's a rabbi with women students. So that's pretty unusual. It tells us a lot about his attitude towards women, which was basically accepted them. I think we can say he accepted them as equal with men, is not only from the fact that the way he associated with them, but also from the fact that he liked to occasionally make a woman sort of the hero in one of his parables. We mentioned some of those on Sunday, in the Sunday talks, right? So
well, I always felt like he was highly ambivalent about marriage. That was always my feeling from what he said. I mean, but I was wondering if any of the others had any of their, if they were willing to share any of their own thoughts.
I think that's a good point, because some of the others may have read some of the things that where people have argued that Jesus was married, and there's good reason to say that. So if some of you think that's the case and you want to share some things about that, we'd sure love to hear it. I think that would be appropriate. So have any sort of come across the theory that Jesus was married, and why some writers believe that?
There is great silence here.
There is great silence. Well, I thought somebody might have read something, because there have actually been literally books written to argue that Jesus must have been married. And they're basically cultural arguments, but they're also, they speculate a little bit about some passages in the Gospels. I can even think of one. I remember reading one of those kinds of arguments where they said, the story of the wedding at Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine, that if you read that story, it's entirely possible that Jesus was actually the groom in the story, that was his wedding. Certainly an interesting reading of that passage. It's not completely out of line. Sort of understand the argument. So I think that might be an example of kinds of evidence that some of these theories are based on.
I would also say that it's possible that Jesus was married, and it wasn't Mary Magdalene that he was married to. So if we look at that passage where he says, you must hate your mother and father to follow me, or to separate yourself from. Why wouldn't that include a wife?
Oh, wow.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a point. That's a good point. That's
That during those lost years.
yeah, and that's kind of part of the ambivalence, because or the ambiguity, I want to say, of what his situation was, because there are passages that you can read and say, doesn't that, like you just did, doesn't that indicate that you didn't have to separate yourself from your wife, right? Even if you were separating yourself from your mother and brothers and sisters, right? Yeah, interesting point. And again, we know the disciples had wives, and so it's clear Jesus isn't against marriage. He doesn't. He just, maybe it wasn't for him, or maybe he just recognized that it was a challenging institution, right? Which anybody who's married knows that that's the
Yeah,
case.
right.
He said it wasn't expedient, is kind of the way they looked at it. So, in other words, it's something to be seriously considered. I actually kind of like what supposedly Socrates said. Someone asked him if he should get married, and Socrates said, if you get married and you find a good wife, then you will have a happy life. If you have a bad wife, you will become a philosopher. And either fate is good. So by all means, get married.
That's
Yeah.
nice. Oh, I like that. I
I
like
have a
that.
good wife and I'm a philosopher. So that just goes to
Yeah.
Socrates wasn't completely right about that, but it is a funny story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so where were we? Um, More on the whether or not Jesus was married. I wonder, I think that would sort of make a difference in how he looked at things to a certain extent, but also,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's hard to trace exactly where that influence might have been, or how that would have affected his way of thinking and being. He obviously didn't have a settled in a house family life that we usually think of with the wife. And of course, neither the disciples, they were travelers, and also the cynics. Before Jesus and his traveling ministry, there were the cynics who traveled, and most of them evidently traveled alone. Most of them were men, but there were also, we know specifically that there were cynic philosophers who had wives, and the wives were also cynic philosophers, and they lived that same lifestyle, that sort of wandering with minimal baggage kind of lifestyle. So, yeah. So I don't think it was an issue. I don't think it was anything uh, that Jesus was sort of inherently opposed to for any particular reason. I think he just probably thought, just make sure you really want to do this, which is kind of the way I've generally counseled people when they come to me and ask me to perform a wedding ceremony. If they do any counseling, is just, recognize what this is and be serious about it, and make sure that this is what you really want to do. I don't try to discourage anybody from getting married. I just want them to be clear in their own minds their own minds and their own hearts about what they're doing.
But
Anyway,
when you think about, I mean, from the impression that I carry through all the years, that Jesus really, in a very radical way, invited his disciples to follow him and travel with him, leave
right.
their regular lives,
Yes,
leave their families and go with him and live itinerant lives.
exactly. Yeah, that's what they were doing. They sometimes traveled with him, and then sometimes, evidently, he sent them out to go to other cities to travel and preach without him.
But not with they didn't bring their families along. They were, in a way, they were not challenged by Jesus, but they left their families to
Yeah,
be with Jesus.
right. They did, and as I said, it's probable that some of the apostles did travel with their wives, that their wives were in that same lifestyle, just like with the cynics. But it would have been a pretty tough lifestyle if they also had children, right? Dragging the kids along with you on your travels. I can't quite imagine what that would be like. So yeah, So and of course, he's not saying everybody needs to do this. he's got a specific group of people who are going out and carrying the message to different places. It wasn't that everybody, that he expected everybody to become a traveling proclaimer of the gospel, proclaimer of the kingdom of God, teaching. But that's what his missionaries did, right? We call them that. We can call them that. And some of them probably did go back and spend time at home, like Peter at his mother-in-law's house or whatever. So it's not like they were traveling absolutely all the time, but it was something that was a big part of what they were doing. And they had, Jesus told his disciples to take nothing except a staff. So I take it that Jesus himself carried a staff, and the staff was primarily for protection, right? Against bandits, which there are a lot of when you're traveling, in that part of the world, when you're traveling down the road, you are almost certain to encounter bandits and would need some form of self-defense. And so I think that's what the point of the staff was. And but he also told them not to take food with them, not to take money with them, right? Not even to take a bag with them. And so they were traveling really, really light, So there wasn't really any accumulation of property and possessions by the people that were by Jesus and his apostles. As communities formed that followed the teaching in different towns that they went to, there could be wealth there. And clearly Jesus and his disciples were supported by, to some extent, by wealthy people. They had possessions, they had a treasury, right? According to the Gospels, Judas was the treasurer. He kept the money that was used to help the poor, right? So they did have collectively some money. They did have collectively some properties, but Jesus and his disciples primarily weren't settled into that. So they had followers who had it, and they had access. They had access to supply, but it wasn't the usual settle down, do a job kind of lifestyle. Jesus had done that, and as a tekton, as a carpenter, whatever kind of work it was that he did. So he had done that type of life, but it wasn't what he left that behind with when he went out to proclaim his message.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So it's 5:00. Can I just kind of make one more point before we close? So people are asking about, who Jesus was and what he was like, in those, we really mainly talking about the lost years. The point I wanted to make is, we know that Jesus was a Jew. That was he was ethnically a Jew. So, right, he was his parentage, he was descended from Jews. And sometimes scholars will make the statement that Jesus was an observant Jew. And I, for the life of me, can't figure out where they get that from. It's clear he was an ethnic Jew, but almost any time he brings up something that has to do with the Jewish law, he takes some kind of exception to it, right? So there's definite laws, for example, about what you should eat and what you should drink. And Jesus said, well, nothing that goes into you defiles you. Eat whatever people put before you. So he basically rejects the kosher laws in a couple of sayings, right? Another place, it was supposed to be a fasting day, and Jesus said, you don't fast when the bridegroom is present, do you? He just sort of rejects the notion that there was a need to fast. Who's the bridegroom? Well, in traditional Jewish allegory, poetic imagery, God is the bride. God is the groom, and Israel is the bride. That imagery is, thick in the Jewish tradition. So part of what he's saying there is God is present, and part of what he's saying there, if God is present, then there's no need to fast, right? So again, the kingdom of God is with you. So anyway, he sort of rejects that. This is about the Sabbath. It's made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Man is Lord over the Sabbath. So basically, we can do whatever we need to do on the Sabbath, kind of thing. It was made for us. We're not made for it. So we can make exceptions to it, right? There's a passage in Thomas, which Lisa may come across as she's reading it, where he seems to say that there's no real importance in circumcision. And that was an idea that was fairly quickly adopted by Paul and the Gentile Christians in general. The ones that weren't circumcised weren't really interested in getting circumcised in order to, at that point in their lives, in order to become a follower of and a member of the community. So to say he was an observant Jew is really stretching the notion of what that means. I think, at most you can say he's Jewish from a very, very liberal tradition, maybe more liberal than any of the others, any others that were around at the time. So yes, so I don't know how much he observed in terms of their traditions, but it seems like every time he says something about them, it's to make a kind of objection to the traditions. So that part of it is, so he's got Jewish background in the sense, not only ethnically, but it's some familiarity with the scriptures. I don't doubt that. Right? He kind of knows what's in there. But you'll notice that most of the sayings, almost none of the sayings, are actually commentaries on the law, which is traditionally what a rabbi would do. They'd quote a story from their scriptures, or they'd talk about the laws of Moses and interpret them. And for the most part, that's not at all what Jesus does. So he's kind of an unusual rabbi, to say the least. The closest thing I could find to parables of the type that Jesus told in his teachings, the closest I could find from that time were the parables that were attributed to some of the cynics. So again, there's that connection with that particular philosophical group. So I kind of agree with John Dominic Crossan and other scholars that we can think of Jesus as a Jewish cynic, and that may be as close as we can get to characterizing him in the context of his time. So that I forgot to take my phone out of my room again. So I'm gonna stop right there for a second. I'm gonna take my phone out of here. So it'll stop making noise. Sorry. So to close, I'd just like to ask for next week a number of options of things that we can get into Jesus' teachings in a sort of general way, and anything that you want to know about that. I sent the Gospel of Miracles. I think Maya sent those to you, or she can send them to you. We can talk about that.
Did you all get it? Did you get it? The text? Yes? Did you get the text? Rosemary, Wilma, I sent an email, and I added the two the two Word documents that James is talking about. You got it? Okay.
Wilma's nodding yes.
Wilma is yeah, the others are muted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll send it again. Okay.
Yes, I got it, but I haven't read it as yet.
Okay. Yeah.
So you can think about that, and we can go into those. Someone also asked about what we're to think of the resurrection. I've been sort of following the story of Jesus, so I put that kind of more towards the end. There were some other questions, but we can go in any of those directions if you want to. Just kind of look them over and see if there's things in there that you want to talk about, or questions that you want to explore in those documents, and maybe we'll go from there. Does that sound good to everyone? If you agree, raise your hand or applaud. Okay.
Yeah.
I do this, thumbs up.
Nice. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, by the